You don't have the outline up, Mike. How are we supposed to begin if we can't read from a page?
You know what I was thinking is if our intrepid producer wants to keep criticizing us for our banter, whether it's our length or how dynamic it is, maybe he wants to pay for our improv classes. What do you think about that? Would you take some
I
improv classes with me?
I improv every day of my life, Mike. I could teach an improv class.
Your
What
your
do you think
job is
this
not that
is?
creative. Stop it. That's not. Don't.
My life is an
You
improvisation, Mike.
is.
I'm winging it.
Well, that's a little too obvious. Maybe you could clean it up a little
I
bit.
need to be scripted.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
And welcome everybody to this
Back to being
episode
scripted
of,
like a true Catholic.
Yeah. Back to this episode of the Voyage podcast, where we're actually going to talk about again, the classic mythological trope of the descent into hell or descent into the underworld. But then, as you can imagine, this has clear parallels to the Christian story, especially as we prepare for the end of the Lenten season and for the Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and then Easter celebration too. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Jacob, do you think you have any background or thoughts or insight into that subject at all?
Never heard of it.
No. Yeah. Heroine of Hell or Underworld.
No,
yeah,
this should be
like
a fairly
that.
loaded. Do you think that we can get it all in about an hour, Mike? You think that we can kind of exhaust this topic in short order?
I don't know if you're doing this on purpose, but part of me thinks we might need to take 3 half-hour segments to maybe get it done according to each of our schedules.
I think that this is a pretty big topic. But hey, 'tis the season, you know?
No, and I think, we wanted to get this one before Holy Week or during Holy Week. We wanted to release it, but it's definitely something that we can keep revisiting every year. Fortunately, Holy Week keeps coming around every year, at last I checked anyway.
Yeah, I think so.
So what we're going to do is we are going to, because like I said, this is not only is it present in the Christian story and it has a lot of Christian theological consequences, but as we kind of talked about in one of our first conversations about the hero's journey, this provides sort of like the human foundation, the human basis for the Gospels themselves. And so this is just one aspect of it. So when we're talking about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, talking about the departure, the initiation, and then the return, and how all of those are fulfilled in Jesus, this is just one of those more specific elements. Do you remember what it's called or what Campbell calls it in his hero's journey?
What? Just
it's got a biblical connotation.
And descent into the underworld. I mean, what?
Well, it's swallowed by the whale. Or belly of the whale.
Okay.
Belly of the whale.
Okay. Sure.
Which again,
biblical
as we both recognize, it not only preceded Jesus in ancient pagan mythology, but even in the Old Testament, and Jesus himself makes this connection, right, between him and Jonah. He calls his resurrection the sign of Jonah.
Hey, wait a second. I think Voyage Comics might just have a comic talks about this subject. Maybe our corporate overlords would appreciate us pushing a little Voyage Comics.
So Voyage has that. Yeah, they have an edition of Jonah.
Jonah's Voyage to Atlantis, and it's the best thing I've ever read, kids. Go get your parents to go buy you 12 copies.
You think kids
hand it out to your
need
friends.
to ask their parents' permission are listening to?
And parents, if you're listening to this, grandparents, this makes a great Easter gift for all of your children and all of your children's friends.
And as we'll talk about this, the trip to the underworld or the swallowed by the whale, it not only has Jesus connotations, but because it has Jesus associations, it has baptism associations, right? You going under the water for the baptism or the submersion. And
do I need to get the outline up in front of me? Because you are hopping all over the place. Can't we just sit with the Jonah thing for a little bit?
I was trying to do was I was trying to tell you that I actually did get it as a gift for my one of my kids' godparents when he was baptized, and the godparents, they have kids of their own. So I was like, oh, this is kind of a cool, baptism gift, not just for the family of the kid being baptized, but for the godparents as well, because then you kind of just it kind of connects them in a little bit more fun and unique way to the whole experience.
Well,
So
okay. So all joking aside, well, maybe not all joking aside, but a lot of it. It's a pretty fun story, like interpretation that they give,
yeah.
because they bring in the Atlantis myth to it and things like that. I'm a sucker for the kind of cross pollination of these types of old stories and things like that. So
Yeah.
I appreciated what they were doing. And here's something that I'll bring up that may or may not. I bet you this isn't on your outline. If you look at the cover to that Jonas comic, when you see the Atlantis in the background, it actually kind of looks vaguely sci-fi looking. And in the comic itself, you don't end up seeing a lot of sci-fi architecture when they get down to Atlantis. But that put in my own mind the idea that the Underworld or Atlantis could be like this kind of like where everything ends up, right? Like it's like a repository of like history. And then that got me thinking about Loki, the TV show, where they end up at the end of time at some point in that story, and at the end of time it's just all the leftovers. It's all the leftovers of history, right?
Well, and again, like, to push this even further,
Underworld motif. So
to push this even further, what's the other baptism connection when it comes to Atlantis? Is what's the story behind Atlantis? Is that it had a sort of catastrophic flood that brought it under, just like Numenor as well, right? In the Silmarillion, Lord of the Rings series. And so you have this Atlantis catastrophic flood, which has another biblical connection to baptism as well, because what is used by the church fathers as a type for baptism was the flood story. And so, having Atlantis and Jonah, you have the Christ dies and resurrects kind of parallel. You have the flooded city, flooded world parallel, which all goes around, which all correlates to baptism too.
It's a heck of a coincidence, Mike. Let me tell you.
If you want to, and actually you brought up Loki, another even more recent example. We've already talked a little bit about the baptism imagery in The Mandalorian. And you have the destroyed world, or almost sunken world of Mandalore, and the mines of Mandalore, which is where Din Djarin has to. There's a redemptive element, right? He has to wash in the pools in the mines of Mandalore, and so you have this entering into, and as we'll see, he meets a monster in that underworld, right? In the waters.
Yeah, there's a giant monster in the deep. Yeah, that's super. It's the mythosaur, by the way.
Oh my gosh,
the mythosaur.
A little on the snout, I think, is what I say.
Yeah, a little on the snout, exactly. So clearly they are doing some really heavy symbolic lifting in Mandalorian season 3 when it comes to
and we're here for it. I mean, we're
the entire
all about
planet.
That, so.
I mean,
and
we're just
again,
racing
friend of the
these
show.
Topics. I mean,
again,
that's our
friend
episode
of the show,
about
John Favreau.
There's our episode about Underworld, folks. Thanks. See you next time.
Well, we both said we had a lot of content, so now we just have to, very quickly, like squirrels. We're like squirrels, one thing to the next. No, like
what
I said,
when about Favreau?
When friend of the show John Favreau finally comes on, right? He can be like, oh yeah, I was so inspired in anticipation of all that you guys were going to talk about, that I had to include all that baptism underworld imagery. Right?
At this point, I hope that the Lord of Spirits people never listen to this podcast, because we've ripped off friend of the show so frequently and so thoroughly that I'm a little embarrassed at this point. But you know what? I'm going to keep doing it because it's endlessly fun. It is endlessly entertaining to refer to other people as a friend of our show.
As people whose clout is so far exceeds ours that
indeed
someday.
Yeah.
This is our vision board.
I'm sorry, fathers.
I'm also getting a note from our producer. We can stop with the commercial. He's had enough of it, so we're gonna keep moving on to.
Oh gosh.
Enough about Voyage products. So really quickly,
I brought up the comic, but we got to keep talking about all the symbolism in Mandalorian.
Yeah, no.
Well, maybe we'll hold on to it for the season 3 recap, but
yeah, we're gonna do like a season finale, season 3 recap when it all finishes up. But so far, I mean, how many episodes have dropped so far? Like 3 or 4, I think.
We got a ways,
They've already very, very heavily dropped into the baptism imagery that we both anticipated, because they kind of tease it in the Book of Boba Fett when Din Djarin shows up too.
You know, I just got to say, I'm just surprised that our producer told us to quit peddling his schlock, because I swear before this episode he was like whining in my ear. He's like, please, 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 please talk more about our comics in this show. And I was like, all right. I mean, I thought that we weren't, you know, kind of corporate sellouts like that, but if you insist, Voyage Comics,
the soul of an artist, I think is the last line. So
I just made
backing
all that
up a little bit.
Kidding.
The hey, come on, don't pull him behind the veil like that. So the etymology of the word. So when we talk about the descent, right, into the underworld. So this actually has a, you know, you're gonna love this, Jacob. There's a Greek word that is oftentimes used in the kind of theological vocabulary, theological conversation called katabasis.
Ooh.
Have you? And it just means down, to go downward. Is just what it like directly translates to. But just like we talk about, you know, the descent into the underworld, which is present in pretty much every like prominent mythological story, and we're gonna go through some of those examples too. But why is it so important? Why was this such a, just like we talked about before, why was it ubiquitous in all of these myths that the hero must go, must be initiated, and then must return? Why must part of this process include going into some form of underworld, right? Not that it has to be literally underground, but why does it always have to include that? And again, a lot of these myths, they precede the Gospels. So it's not like people are just copying the Christian story, trying to do like some sort of allegory.
And I mean, it is really ubiquitous. It's like all of them, like, every character goes into the underworld.
I mean, one of the first ones that I wanted to include is Beowulf, right? Just because it's so foundational to the English language, to Tolkien, right? Which we've talked about in the past, and things like that.
So Beowulf goes into the cave to confront Grendel, right? That's what
Grendel's mother, right?
Oh, Grendel's mother. Yeah, because he kills them.
Because he kills Grendel, then she comes, and then he chases her back into So, but there again, that might be part of it too. That it's not the, you know, the monster at the beginning. It's the mother, right? The mother of the monsters. So there's probably some element to that too. That's where he meets her or chases her. Because, and I don't know if maybe this is part of it, but like a lot of times, the god of the underworld, like Hades, you know, is usually a guy, but like death itself, isn't death usually depicted as like a goddess? Or I'm just thinking of like Kali,
you're right,
in Indian mythology, or in Hinduism, and then doesn't even Saint Francis of Assisi call it sister death? I think he says sister death too, in his kind of like spirituality and theology.
Well, let's lay out some basic geography / I don't know, categorization here, because I think that when we're talking about you could talk about the underworld as a place, or you can talk about the underworld as a person, and I think they both are used, and they're both used together, and they overlap with each other and things like that. And so the idea of Hades, the place of the dead, right, which is not hell, right? Like
not hell in the Christian sense.
Not in the Christian sense. Yeah. Well, not in the classical Christian sense. I do think that there's 100% a folklore, a Christian folklore. In fact, I think a lot of modern Christianity in America, right, that's very divorced from. And this is not a euphemism for Protestantism, because even Protestants, classical Protestantism, you know, traditions rooted in things like Anglicanism or Lutheranism or even Calvinism, you know, or like the Reformed Church, traditional Reformed churches, I don't think that they are the purveyors of some of this kind of like caricature or folklore. But so if I'm being jaded, we can call it a caricature of what Christianity is actually teaching. But I don't even think that's the most accurate way to view it. I think that the idea that there are little demons running around like Looney Tunes hell, like little
Yeah,
demons
well,
running
it's
around with
almost it's sort of
pitchforks.
like like you
Is
said,
folklore.
a degradation of the Christian view, but it's also kind of like a neo-pagan. It's like kind of like a synthesis of those, like a syncretism of the neo-pagan and degradation of Christian view of hell slash Hades slash underworld. It's kind of just almost like an amalgamation of all of those. Is
Well,
that
and
kind
it
of what
is.
you're?
I don't think that. I think a lot of that imagery was not malicious. I think a lot of the
No.
development of the idea of hell being a place. Well, and hey, let's be fair. A lot of that idea does come from medieval and Renaissance depictions, right? Or even even the New Testament itself, when Jesus is talking about weeping and gnashing of teeth, um, eh, or the Book of Revelation talking about a lake of fire, right? So it's not like people are just like making this up whole cloth. I think like what you said, a kind of like synthesis or syncretism is accurate, but also it's just a lot of hellfire preaching from America's unique kind of like religious history with these kind of great awakenings
Yeah, and like
and
what
things like
image is
that.
going to resonate? What image
Revival,
is going
tent
to catch
revival,
hold?
religion. And so a lot of America's religious history is very and I don't mean this in a mean-spirited way at all, right? I have a lot of affection for this type of thing, frankly. Um but it's kind of lowbrow. It's kind of populist.
Yeah.
It's uneducated frontiers people um evolving their sense of what hell is through the preaching that they're hearing and through the lives they're living and all that stuff. And so it's very folklory. And I think that's the right word for it. I think that's it's America's equivalent, American Protestantism's equivalent of the type of thing that you get with like fairies in,
Well,
Celtic
and
lands or something like that.
why I referred to it as neo-pagan is actually because like if you go back to kind of the pre-Christian understanding, the development of what Christians call hell, you don't really see that. You see more of this just underworld, place of the dead, kind of like the shades sort of thing.
Mhm.
And the idea that more closely resonates to like the judgment and like you were kind of saying the hellfire or the devil and the demons and stuff like that's a little bit. I mean, it's not a direct parallel, and it's not supposed to be.
No.
And so whether we're talking about like so I mentioned Beowulf going into that place of like going into that underworld and fighting this sort of like death itself, right? Grendel's
Yep.
mother. The other example I couldn't think of right away, but it's actually not in ancient mythology. It's in the modern mythology of the Avengers and Thanos. Why does Thanos, and this isn't communicated in the movie, but he has this love affair or he has this crush on death
Oh, death.
itself.
Yeah, out
Right?
of the comics. Out of the comics.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's a great example of personification of death.
Yeah,
What the
so and there
two what
again,
the
it's a woman
two
though, right? That's the
and it is, and it is. And it's also all right, I mean, so basically what Mike is saying, everyone, is that women are the devil and
oh boy.
they belong in the underworld. You're the one
Oof.
you're the one that keeps bringing it up, Mike. That's all I'm saying.
I mean, blame Beowulf, I guess. or not Beowulf, blame
hell hath
unknown
no
author.
fury like a Grendel mother scorned.
Yeah.
There, maybe that's an episode title. But no, it's
Absolutely
it's
not.
I do think all right, so all poking fun at Mike aside, I do think that there is that kind of way back at the beginning of this show, beginning of this podcast, during those hero's journey episodes, we talked about masculine and feminine archetypal symbolism, right?
Yeah.
And
And actually in the trickster episode too.
oh,
But sorry,
okay.
keep going.
Yeah, well, so anyway, feminine symbolism does actually kind of belong on the hidden, mysterious side of the spectrum, right? And so that's people always want to put negative connotations on this stuff, and it's not meant to be negative. God gives us death as a reprieve from our lives of sin, right? I mean, it's not that God wants death to exist per se, but it's a corrective. It
So, and
is.
this is why I mentioned Saint Francis of Assisi. He referred to sister death not as an insult, not as a criticism, but like you were saying, this sort of he wanted to see her in this regard to death becomes a means of closer union with God. And so that's the important thing to keep in mind too. And you could even go back to the garden and say God was giving death as a mercy
100%.
because
that's where I'm getting where
Yeah.
I'm getting my train of thought from. Though I do like the fact that you brought up St. Francis talking about sister death and things like that. There's an interesting tension within Christian tradition, and I don't mean this. I think this is a feature and not a bug. I really do. There's an interesting tension in Christian tradition between, well, do we like death or do we not like death, right? Like going all the way back to St. Paul saying it's better for me to die and go to my Lord, but better for you that I stick around. But so there's lots of people saying that, well, here, let me start here. You know, I haven't been to a Catholic, well, maybe I have been to a Catholic funeral actually. But more recently I've been to an Orthodox funeral, and there's lots of weeping and wailing and, sackcloth and ashes in that service. The Orthodox Church service is very much talking about death as a very, very sad, terrible, no good thing. But then it also obviously comes around and talks about the hope of the resurrection and things like that. But it doesn't shy away from, hey, this is not right. This is not correct. This makes us really sad. We do not like this, right?
And to just jump back to the thing you were saying about St. Francis, is he could only call it her sister death and not see her as a monster because of the resurrection, because he so acutely was aware of the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the consequences that meant for him as a member of the body of Christ, the church.
Yep.
And so that's why he could call her sister and not monster, not Grendel's mother, right? Like we were just kind of talking about. But sorry, I didn't mean to.
No,
I just wanted to kind of.
That's a fine addition to it. I think that you're 100% right that our relationship with death is transformed by Christ, and that so there's basically a memory and a continuity. I'm not saying that it's not still sad when our beloved, people in our lives die, right? Because we miss them, right? And it divorces us from them. We not to oh, what dang it? What the great divorce, C.S. Lewis, whatever. That was a sly little reference. But
Oh, okay.
I know I nailed it. I nailed the delivery on
Marriage of Heaven and Hell, William Blake, C.S. Lewis, Great Divorce. Yeah.
But it puts a gulf between us and our loved ones in the body, and yet ironically it brings us closer than ever, kind of in the spirit. So, but before Christ transforms our understanding of reality, there's only the pagan depictions. There's only the idea that, and this is even in, I shouldn't even say pagan descriptions, because I think that even the Hebrews looked at Sheol as it's the same concept as a classical depiction from like Greece of just a shadowy place of the dead where people just kind of stand around. And this is actually
what's cool about this, and this wasn't the direction originally, but just as a very brief detour, this is one of the great things about the deuterocanonical books, is because they were so heavily influenced by the Greek language and Greek thinking, that's where you start to see the persistence of the soul, the immortality of the soul, and the resurrection come out so strongly. Some of the best Bible verses in the Old Testament about the resurrection are from Maccabees and from the Book of Wisdom, which are both two of those 7 deuterocanonical books that are a product of the Greek Septuagint. And so it's just such
beautiful.
and they are 2 of my favorites, actually. Two of my favorites in the whole Bible.
They actually are.
I love Maccabees is one of the most underrated books in the whole. I mean, of course.
Well, it just doesn't get the love it deserves because of like the context of like kind of Western history and how they get this kind of. They ended up with this kind of second-class status. I don't think that's a technically accurate statement, but deuterocanonical, right? It kind of literally means second list. Yeah.
Second list.
Whereas in Orthodoxy we don't define them as second class. But anyway,
neither do Catholics. Okay, so my joke was always the reason why nobody reads Maccabees is because they're only in Catholic Bibles and Catholics don't read the Bible. But again, that's low hanging fruit. So, and now now I can get hate from as a fellow Catholic, I'm just making a joke. But
hey, I didn't say it, folks.
Anyway,
but.
Only I can say that.
That's right. But yeah, we do read those verses like sparks amongst the rubble. I don't have it memorized, but like their soul will
just the speech of the brothers who are being martyred, and where it's like, you can take these hands, I know I'm gonna get them back, right? And it's just like, just knocks you on your ass. Oh, sorry. just knocks you right
knocks
over.
you right into the underworld.
Yeah, something like that.
No, they're really, really wonderful text.
Yeah.
But anyway,
But there again,
it's
that's the Old Testament, like that had to develop even in the Old Testament, and it developed from this, Greek philosophical tradition that started to be integrated or infused into the Jewish revelation, right? Into the Jewish scriptures, Hebrew scriptures, more accurately. But
well, yeah, I also, so here's something that was pointed out on that Lord of Spirits podcast, that made me go, huh, was Father DeYoung on that podcast. He says that Greek culture was actually the last great Middle Eastern culture, right? We think of ancient Greece as the beginning of Western culture, and I that's fine. I don't think that that's not true, but it's fundamentally akin to the cultures of the Middle East, right? That it's actually a part. It has just as much identity there as it does with what comes after with Rome. It's basically a liminal culture, is how I understand it now, where it's where the East and the West kind of like meet almost. So that being said, it's not, when we talk about Greece influencing the Old Testament or whatever, I think a better way to phrase that, just to clarify, is that it's the same culture. It's the same knowledge of cosmology. And so it's not necessarily that this idea is that things were innovated or adopted or something like that. It's more like they were just sharing a
it's in
continuity, a
continuity. Yeah.
historical, a historical view of creation, of how creation functions and how it works and things like that.
Well, and that's why, we've talked a little bit about some of the Old Testament examples, which is why, whether it's Jonah, First Samuel also talks about the Lord bringing to Sheol and then raises up, which I think is really interesting that you have such an early, we were just talking about how it's the deuterocanonical books that speak so explicitly, especially from Old Testament standards, about resurrection. But here we have all the way back in First Samuel, that line of going down to the descent into the underworld, or descent to the dead, and then rising up again, which there again, you look at Jonah. Jonah is, even though, whether you want to consider it like Jonah as a historical person, as a prophet, which we don't even have to get into that conversation right now, it's still a really, really old parable, if nothing else. Whether, like I said, however historical you want to consider it, that's not the point of this conversation right now.
Sure.
And it was still very formative, as we've already mentioned, to the prophecy of Jesus's resurrection. And it's not put on the lips of St. Paul or St. Peter or St. John, but Jesus himself, who refers to the sign of Jonah.
No, and it's interesting because that was obviously in Sunday school. It's Pinocchio, right? Like it's just a fun story about someone being swallowed up. Another interesting thing is we will read the entire book of Jonah on, is it Saturday? It might be Holy Saturday. Now I'm forgetting when it gets read. But in our preparation for Pascha, for Easter, during the Old Testament reading at a service, we read the entire book of Jonah. When you actually read the entire book of Jonah, and like some of the prayer that Jonah says while he's in the belly of the beast, the belly of the whale, it's actually really obvious that this is an underworld tale. Like that he's talking about death and being dead. And I think I probably just didn't pay close enough attention to it before experiencing it within the context of the church services, but also even if I think that I would still just think he was like being metaphorical.
You can't, and you can't shake
he's in the
loose
middle
the
of something,
like original presentation of, like you said, the Sunday school version, or even more formative. Maybe even it's like we have the Pinocchio version. So it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, you really have to kind of strip so much away and look at it with fresh eyes. One of the things
it makes
that I wanted
it super cool, though. I mean, let me just point out that it's actually way cooler when you realize that this is a straight.
And it has way more mythological connections and implications than you realize as well. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up, we mentioned before how the connections between the birth of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. You were kind of talking about that, and we kind of talked about it with The Last of Us too, right? But
no, for sure.
So actually, this isn't
was that this episode?
This isn't just some this wasn't just some genius connection that I came up with. Believe it or not, Jacob, Saint Ambrose. I know you don't want to accept this, but in the Western tradition, Saint Ambrose of Milan.
Saint Ambrose, he's one of ours. We pretty sure he was before 1054.
How far east is Milan again? Can you remind me? Yeah. So he actually in his writings.
Who was his emperor at that time? Out of sheer curiosity.
Was it Theodosius? Was it?
No, actually, I'm sure. Wasn't it Constantine?
He was a little bit after, I think.
Oh, was he?
Maybe they intersected.
Okay.
That's
whatever.
Anyway,
I was trying to get a score.
Oh,
but,
okay.
that didn't work. So go on.
No, and see, the thing is too is I sometimes conflate a lot of his life with Saint Augustine's, just because Saint Augustine was his student and the kind of one of the big inspirations for his conversion to Christianity. But anyway, moving on. So Saint Ambrose actually has in his writings, he compares the belly of the whale, the Jonah belly of the whale, to the womb of Mary. And so we get all of these church fathers, or all this Christian theology about the belly of the whale and the tomb, which again comes right from the words of Jesus. That's not a controversial connection. But Saint Ambrose, but think of the implications of this though, is that if the belly of the whale is the womb of Mary, then where did Jesus descend from? Right? His own descent from heaven was a descending, just like his descent from life to death was a descent. So now, stick with me. We actually see that in one of our modern mythologies, because do you remember the first Thor movie? The Thor movie, like in the MCU.
I do.
He has to descend down into, and what's his descent into the underworld? It's, from his perspective.
Oh, to Earth.
It's down to
He gets exiled to Earth.
Yeah, and so that's actually, but that actually is that's the connection between God the Son, and again, we don't have to look at it purely in terms of like a bad thing, like, oh, Earth is so bad, but from any Jewish or Christian perspective, it's not heaven, right? And so it is a descent into a less alive place. And so
that
we
just
see
goes to the fractal nature of reality and symbolism and things like that, right? Because I totally agree with you. For one, I'm fascinated by what St. Ambrose is bringing up here. I've not heard that before. That's really interesting. But or at least I don't think I've heard it. Watch it be like in our, church services somewhere, whatever.
Yeah,
of course, everything's in our church services, so don't blame me.
Everything's in your church services, right?
Hey, that could be an inclusive hour. Maybe I was referring to just classical Christian church services.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd feel more comfortable about that pre-Vatican II, but hey, all right, we won't go there.
Please.
No, but that's such an interesting point that he's making and that you're bringing into this conversation. So, for example, I was randomly, actually not in preparation for this conversation, but it helps, as it turns out, is I was looking into this use of the term chthonic, which I think is Greek. I believe it's Greek. And
sounds like it.
It's a chthonic is the word. Now I was thinking like Cthulhu, like Cthulhu mythos, like H.P. Lovecraft stuff, right? Which we'll have to have a conversation about that in one of these episodes. But chthonic is actually just this academic term, ancient term for things related to the underworld, right? But the underworld, the etymology for that chthonic term is actually a reference to dirt. It's a reference to earth, right? Like literally. And so the idea is that the underworld is under the earth, right? Or it's in the ground, right? Or in a cave or something like that, which Jesus was born in a cave, right? So it's very interesting.
Another birth to womb to tomb connection, right?
But what fascinates me, what is fascinating to me about that is that, okay, so if the underworld in this chthonic sense is actually a reference to just Earth, just like Earth in reality, and so to your point, Jesus's descent into Earth, right, is the beginning of his chthonic descent that terminates in his descent going further down, right?
Yeah.
But it's almost like he has to go like his descent, it's multi-layered. Is it an onion?
Well,
It's
everything
he has to go through all the stages of
this
descents
so this
to get
goes
to the very
to
bottom.
again a point of agreement between Catholic and Orthodox when it comes to the redemption is that every act of the Son was redemptive, not just the death. And this
Yep.
is why the parallels, why the connection between the birth, the womb, and the tomb is so important, is because it sort of bookends how every aspect of God the Son, every aspect of Jesus' ministry was this descent into the underworld and then a rising up.
Well, and
And
it's funny.
so, oh yeah,
So
go ahead.
before going into getting into classical Christianity and all of its kind of teachings and things like that, um, I didn't, Jesus's life was just an opportunity for him to say some really cool stuff, but his redemptive acts were regulated to Holy Week, right? Like everything leading up to it was the icing on the cake, but it was all basically, relatively speaking, inconsequential. In other words, there's this kind of like unspoken thought, because I don't necessarily think that I was taught this, but it's just a matter of emphasis, right? That, in theory, Jesus could have shown up and just died right away. And, he didn't have to be
Well,
here for an entire
and
lifetime.
actually, to that point, St. Thomas Aquinas even talks about how at the circumcision of Jesus, that was enough blood to save the entire world, right? The
Mm.
blood of Christ was shed at his circumcision. And so, in a sense, you didn't need any more after that. It's not like God
Well,
was waiting for a certain,
here's what I would point. I mean, that would be see, some of that didn't hit me quite right in the sense that, like, this goes all the way back to the beginning of our podcast. I'm a recapitulation guy, right? Like, I think that, it's not about Jesus is just showing up to shed blood. It's about him showing up to live a human existence. And that means eventually shedding blood, or at the very least dying. But it's the fullness of his entire experience as a human. And where I was going with my train of thought was, um, there's actually not a difference between his end of life redemptive arc and the rest of it. In other words, it's all still a descent into, it's all still a harrowing of hell. Even when he's in the bloom of youth, even when he's because relatively speaking, he's coming from his eternal reality with God, and he's entering into Earth, the chthonic world, right? And it's just so we from our perspective, we see the underworld as something kind of distinguished from our living existence right now. And hey, to a great extent, it is, right? I'm not saying there's no difference there, but I'm also saying that they are fundamentally akin. And I would say that that's even true theologically post fall, that the act of humanity leaving the garden and leaving paradise has actually transformed this into a quote unquote chthonic world that is basically just layers of death. Um, of course, in most of the myths that we're talking about, they are treating the underworld as, they're not getting into it the way that we're getting into it right now. But I think it's fascinating rumination, let's just say.
oh, and well, and just to backtrack a little bit, not because I feel like I need to defend Aquinas. So when I brought that up, it was actually to your point. It was to emphasize that
Hmm.
it wasn't just about the one act of shedding blood, because then, like I said, or like Aquinas said, like then
Oh,
they only would have
if it
needed
was
the
just
one.
about bloodshedding, well,
Yeah.
he did that as a baby.
Yeah.
Oh, I get what
So
you're
that
saying.
was
I get
my
what you're
so it was the
okay.
to emphasize kind of like what you're saying, that there was something even more than just the shedding of blood. It was this, whether you want to call it the recapitulation, or from again the ancient Christian perspective, it was also the establishment of the church. His body continued out through time. So all of those sorts of things, like you are, if you only saw it as the shedding of blood, then you would be confronted with all of this other evidence which speaks against it. And so that's the, and whether you want to say, because obviously none of it is an argument from necessity, to use a Thomistic term, but an argument from fittingness, that of course God could have, just so to speak, snapped his fingers. But it wasn't just about the, doing the one act. It was about the entire thing. The whole life was redemptive, right? From the womb to the tomb.
Absolutely. I kind of wonder, and I don't want to derail the conversation. I kind of wonder, listen, on the one hand, there are no necessities with God, right? In the sense that he is God and he's the one that's making the choices here. But on the other hand, because of God's unwillingness because of the choices that God does make and his unwillingness to forego our free will, and he wants to create real people, things like that. To some extent, there is no snapping of, like, once he's made that choice, once he's decided that the reality that he wants is this reality, the one that has been created, it's not, there is no snapping of the fingers in that regard, because Christ has to do all that. Like he has to, for our sake, right? And it has to be this kind of living reality. It can't be a propositional thing. It's just, we have to, because we have to do it too. And I do think that's kind of what you were getting at, is that like he has to pave this template, this road, this icon, this life, right? This way. And then we have to follow that way. And then we have to be shaped to that way, and it has to follow his life trajectory.
Speaking of that, following in the footsteps, recapitulation sort of idea, do you want to know what the next catabasis scene, the next descent that we're going to talk about? So not only was it the descent of God the Son into time, into creation, in the person of Jesus, but actually the one that we follow in these footsteps is the baptism. That was a descent into the water, into the depths. And that's what our baptism is supposed to be, because that's actually a lot of biblical commentators will talk about the significance of the Jordan River, which is where Jesus was baptized, being the lowest point in the Holy Land. And it was significant going all the way back to the story of Elijah. Elijah goes from the top of the mountain where he hears the voice of God, where he has these divine experiences, but he makes this descent all the way down to the River Jordan, which is where he is taken up by the fiery chariot. And that was where John the Baptist emerges, because Jesus says John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah, or he's the return of Elijah that the Jewish people were looking for. And that's then obviously where Jesus then comes onto the scene for his own baptism.
I see.
And so that was it was a descent to the lowest point, but then it was a descent into the water, which is what baptism is, right? And that's into the underworld. We die with Christ, and then we rise with Christ. And so the River Jordan is another, or the baptism, I should say, baptism of Jesus is another important descent.
Well, and let's just quick explicate the reality that baptism is death, right? You had to have loved in Game of Thrones when the which house was it that was the Kraken people?
Theon Greyjoy, or not House
the
Greyjoy,
Iron Islands, Iron Islands, they drown people.
What is dead? What is dead may never die.
May never die. Yeah, it's like, wow. Okay, you're definitely. And I know that's definitely.
We've joked about
you got
this,
that
but you
somewhere,
and I,
George R. R. Martin.
we've had a conversation about all of the really crazy Christian imagery in Game of Thrones. Besides, think of like the fiery heart, as an image for the Sacred Heart of Jesus. But anyway, that's a whole other episode.
It is a whole thing, but
the Iron Islands,
we did kind of briefly mention like the flood earlier. I don't know if we've talked about the passing through the Red Sea with the Israelites
classic,
or whatever
type image.
These motifs, this reality that's and that was literally Israel's baptism, crossing through the Red Sea. So this idea of baptism is quite intentional, right? The sea as such is
it was a place of death.
A place of death, right?
Place
a
of
symbol
chaos.
of death, and again, like our symbol doesn't mean fake or not real, like humans can't live in the ocean. we can stay there for a little bit, we can visit it, but it's not our natural habitat, and we will die if there's not some kind of technology outside of us that prevents us from dying, right? It is not, we are not natives there. So it is a place of death. And it's a place of formlessness, right? Going back to the very beginning, when God makes the heaven and the earth, and the earth is without form and void, that's all a reference to it being basically just like this oceanic, um,
because it says the Spirit hovers over the waters.
unformed.
So it gives you the
does,
sense of like, yeah, the waters were there, quote unquote, first or beforehand. But like you said, it was this place of chaos, this place of death and, well, non-life.
Absolutely. Yep.
So
did you, this is a little different, but it's kind of similar. In like Norse mythology, it's the beginning, their kind of beginning story is that there's fire and there's ice, and the fire and the ice mix.
And they wrote a song about
steam.
And somebody wrote a song about it. Is that what you're going to say?
I actually wasn't even thinking that.
I can't believe you weren't, but yeah.
Does Martin have any original ideas, Mike?
Another wink for those Game of Thrones fans. Yeah, the book series is Song of Fire and Ice, but
yeah,
Ice and Fire. No, Ice and Fire, Fire and Ice. I don't know. I can't remember.
Song of Fire and Ice.
Can't remember which one.
Yeah, okay. That's what rolls off my tongue. So
people would say the same about Tolkien. They're like, did he have any original ideas, or was it just? It's like
This is not the podcast that's going to actually. I mean, I'll joke it. We're not the guys that think it's wrong to not have original ideas, right? I think our whole point is that there is nothing new under the sun, and that you do find there's either truth or untruth. It's not a question of originality. It's a question of are you following what's real or not.
No, don't you remember that C.S. Lewis quote of "Don't worry about saying something original, just say something true"? Is that? Have you ever heard that? I'm kind of paraphrasing, but yeah, no, it's I don't remember where in C.S. Lewis, but
very good.
It might be one of those that you just maybe it's attributed.
It's just been imbibed or something. But So anyway, but they believe that the world came out of steam, basically. So which is another kind of. There's interesting parallels there. It's like light and darkness, fire and ice, and the world comes from the formation of those two things. But anyway, that was kind of a tangent.
No, well, and actually, because we have a fire kind of like idea coming up too, and so. Yeah, well, it's down the pike. We keep coming across.
Well, if you really want to keep going with the analogy, the center of hell in Dante's.
It's a lake of ice. Yeah, I can't. I was looking. I couldn't wait until we could talk about Dante because we
haven't even got another. How are we going to get anywhere? There's just so much to cover.
No, I know, definitely. But... I mean, so we kind of that's one of the big, I think that's one of the really big pivot points. If we want to look at the whole, it wasn't just the physical death that we look at in the death of Jesus, but really the entire life, ministry, and death, right? Every act of God the Son was redemptive, whether we talk about coming down from heaven, and then we see, with the womb of Mary being connected to the tomb, like Ambrose says, the River Jordan being that kind of pivot point, right? As the start of his ministry. And then, of course, his death on Good Friday, and then going to the realm of the dead or going into Hades. Those are kind of the big ones when we want to talk about the ministry of Jesus and the Gospels and stuff. But yeah, we can see the sort of post-Gospels or post-biblical Christian myth of Dante's Divine Comedy. What does he have to do first, right? And so I teach this with my high schoolers, and we talk about, it starts off him being in a dark wood. And I say, okay, you guys know fairy tales. What is the dark wood always? And they're like, yeah, it's danger, it's confusion, it's uncertainty, but what is
what Dante left out was the basket that he's bringing to grandma's house and the red hood that he's got.
Well, he's confronted by a wolf in that scene, right? So he actually
and
wants
a leopard, right? There's a couple animals that I remember that. Now.
So he wants to ascend this mountain himself. And I said, okay, again, you guys know your mythology. Who's up high? And they're like, oh, that's God. That's the gods. He wants to get up to God himself, but he's stopped by these three things preventing him. And I said, okay, again, you guys know your theology. What's the one thing preventing us to be with God? And it's our sin. And so he has to take this descent first. He has to go into, and again, from the kind of Christian understanding, it's the hell of the damned, because Virgil is going to show him this is what the nature of sin looks like from God's perspective. Mm-hmm. And it's only after he understands it that he can then start to emerge and climb up, right? With Virgil as his guide, with God's grace, climb up that mountain of purgatory.
True repentance necessitates self-awareness. It necessitates true knowledge of what you need to repent of and what the nature of it is. Hey, what was the third? There's 3 beasts that he gets confronted by.
A lion is the other one.
A lion, a leopard and a wolf?
And a she-wolf.
She-wolf.
And there's debate about what each one represents. Some people say the she-wolf represents greed. Some people say the lion represents pride. And basically, I think the main idea is that it's the sins in Dante's life that's keeping him, right? Whether you want to see it from a personal example or, See, I tell my students, put yourself in his shoes. It's anything that keeps you from God, basically. But
right, no, and that's fair. I wonder if this is true. Recently, I've been getting a little bit back into kind of Greek mythology a little bit, and I was again just apropos for this conversation. It turns out was looking a little bit more into Hecate,
the goddess of magic, right?
Yeah, right. Well, she's also an underworld figure. But it turns out that she's basically her real claim to fame, like her biggest embodiment is, or at least for the Greeks anyway, was that she was a kind of liminal space lady. Liminal space, lady, not liminal space lady.
Now I'm disappointed.
Yeah, I know, right? That sounded way cooler.
But isn't space just all liminal space? Like, isn't outer space just liminal space? So if you are a space lady, then it's all liminal. Sorry, I didn't mean to keep going.
No, but so her figure would be at crossroads. Her figure would be at doorways. Her figure would be at the transition point between one thing and another, right? She's a transition point person, which is why she became an underworld figure, because it's the transition from life to death.
Well, isn't it a Twilight thing too? Sorry to
wait, like the
no, not the series Twilight. I mean, like literal.
Oh, we're gonna bring in some vampires, sparkly vampires.
No, actual like the transition between day and night is
that would make sense, because she's also a lunar deity and things
but that's
like
also but that's also again, not just in Greek mythology, but that's always like you think of like when witches emerge or when the spirits come out.
She becomes like the witch goddess, right? Like definitely in the Middle Ages is when she really starts to become that. But it has antecedents back into Greece too. It's just that she's known, like basically Shakespeare kind of like, for modern people anyway. Shakespeare was taking that from his medieval tradition, but
he didn't make it up either.
I know. Can you believe it? But where I was going is that she actually was always affiliated with 3 animals. And so where my brain was going is like, oh, what was the 3 animals that he met again? Because one of them is a wolf, I think.
Okay.
I'd have to go back and study the Hecate stuff again. Because I don't know if it was, I think one of them was like a snake, for example. So maybe it doesn't fit. But I was like, maybe Dante's playing up on the liminal Hecate thing.
And we're definitely doing if not a whole Dante episode, like each aspect of, because Dante's Divine Comedy it's just one of the greatest works of literature ever made. And so we've got to do, and obviously with all the incorporation of mythology, but then how many times Dante's imagery and Dante's ideas have been adapted to modern mythology, to modern stories. He's definitely, I mean, we're going to have to, spend more time with him. But
I've heard him recently referred to as the first modern author.
Okay.
Like there's like kind of a distinguishing. That was Richard Rowland. I can even name drop the guy that said that, just to give him proper credit. Which is an interesting thought, because he's the first person that puts himself in the story, that actually is kind of self-aware, and it's kind of like a meta story.
And to one more thing, at least to Dante's point too. So who is Dante's guide through the underworld is Virgil. And Virgil is the poet responsible for the Aeneid, whose main character Aeneas also has an underworld journey that we haven't talked about yet. So that's another kind of important point to include is, so like I said, obviously Dante, in a sense, didn't make it up himself either, right? He's following in this very long tradition of not only epic poetry, not only mythology, but then he is, you can almost say, like baptizing it and giving it this very not arbitrary Christian flavor, but you could almost see how, kind of like what we try to do in our conversations, see how the seed of Christianity is present in all of this ancient and modern mythology. He was doing the same thing from his,
Sure.
13th century context.
Well, to your point about how Dante influences so much, he's kind of the first. I don't know if this is true. This is probably not true, but I will say that his influence is felt in, let's just say, something like Sandman, where
Oh my
basically
gosh,
it's
yeah.
like a big old mix. Like it's like Dante just wanted to take all of these different influences and put them in a blender and create something sensible out of it that is so fun. Like it's so
That's another
cool because it's like there's he's just referencing fictitious characters, historical characters, all these things, and those are kind of like my favorite stories.
how
Is
we
these
have
kind of
not
stories
turned
that
our separate private conversations about Neil Gaiman and Sandman into a episode yet is just, it's beyond me, because
it
we've had
hasn't
so many of
happened
those
yet.
too.
Yeah.
We just, I mean, and I was texting you the other day about the Sandman episode that I was like, this is incredible. So not
Oh,
that
and
we
there's
need to,
definitely there's both the bring it back at the beginning of this conversation. There is a place of death and a person of death
Mhm.
within that, which is again a very very common reality here, because it's always about the experience of death. Like, and so you can experience death as a place. Like, in other words, you can typify death as a place, or you can typify death as a person, right? And they both have their application, uh, and this is just how humans have always done it. They've always done it that way.
And we've mentioned how even in the Christian tradition, I mean, Saint Francis of Assisi, referring to it as sister death was
Right.
significant, not just because it's personable, but that it's familial. And so that's where, death goes from being a monster to, in a sense, a family member because of the resurrection, because of the advent of Christ too. So
Well, so
um
technically, this is like a Heroine of Hell episode, right? And so we spent more time talking about just like the underworld as such and all its different permutations, but basically, and again, this is all relatively recent knowledge for me. Um, uh, Christ almost becomes like the Lord of the underworld, right? Like
yeah,
he takes the throne of the
he
underworld,
ties up the strong man. That's part of
Yeah,
his, that's one of his prophecies in the
which
gospels.
I never thought of it like that.
Oh,
And then
you'll
even
get there, Jacob. I'll bring you along.
well, you think of like death and hell and Hades or whatever as the place that like, well, it's rooted in equating hell and Hades, right? In my mind is one of the reasons why I didn't
Mhm.
see it before. But then also it's always just like the thing that Jesus destroys, right? I didn't think of it as the thing that Jesus takes ownership of,
Well, and that's
and
actually from the book of Revelation too, when they talk about, we usually think of just the dragon being like thrown into the fire, but even death itself gets
you know,
conquered in the
that's
book of
right.
Revelation too. So, another
Hey,
example. Oh, go
oh, go
ahead.
on. Well, all
I
right,
was gonna.
before this episode ends, I want to talk about Disney's Hercules. All right,
That's okay. Yeah, that's
are you
yeah.
going there? Were you going to go
I,
there?
okay. I hate that I keep bringing this up, but it's on the outline, Jacob. I hate it says, it actually says Hercules parentheses in the Disney movie. I wanted to just talk specifically about,
Specifically, the Disney movie. Yeah, I
yeah,
mean because
yeah.
Hercules himself also has
Yeah,
some
that's one of
underworld.
the, I think it's the 12th labor or something, but
Yeah,
it's one of the
but
labors of
the Disney
Hercules.
movie specifically, uh,
Yeah, you have a death
I
and
don't know.
resurrection sort of
Do
scene.
you want to?
No,
Do
no, no,
you
I
want?
actually was going to
Where do
bring
you
up
want to
Steve
go?
Rogers because in the first Avengers, he has a
Oh,
descent into the
in a
ice,
place of ice, in a place
into
of
the
ice.
water.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then but then he
Wow.
emerges, of course, in the Avengers movie. So, but no, no, no.
Mhm.
You talk about Disney's Hercules.
Okay,
What's
so Disney's Hercules, it came out right around the time I thought Disney movies weren't as cool as they used to be, right?
and then you're
So I
like, how
didn't.
wrong I
How
was.
wrong I was. No, I mean that's definitely true. I mean, I won't speak to some modern stuff, but definitely all the classic Disney stuff that I grew up with. That's all still pure gold, baby. But
It's called
you
the
know,
golden age. Yeah.
you go through this angsty teenage phase, and suddenly kid stuff is kid stuff, right? But when I revisited, after I got out of that and realized that you could be cool and still appreciate children's things, um, Disney's Hercules is it's a gospel film. And it's literally a
No,
gospel film
if
because
people
the
want to
music
complain about the Christianization of Greek mythology, it's like you just don't show them that, because then they'll just go.
it's
Yeah,
it is so specifically. I mean, honestly, if you want a nice movie to watch with your kids on Easter, go ahead and watch Hercules.
it's like hand feeding it, and you could almost be cynical about it and be like, see, that's, it was just patronizing the Christian audience that was gonna pay to watch it and watch it or whatever. But then
Which
it's like,
I
you know what,
don't
fine.
think anyone's accused Disney of ever, even during the golden age. I don't think Disney was like really trying to necessarily cater to the Christian audience, but evidently they were in this one because okay, so point yeah, at a superficial level, you know how most, especially in the '90s, they started to experiment with like different ways of like captivating audiences, and they were kind of doing some playful things with like what type of music they were using in their movies. And
Mm,
Hercules uses gospel music, like Southern gospel, like Baptist
yeah,
choir
for the
gospel
muses,
music.
yeah, the
Yeah,
muses, all
like
right, yeah.
it is gospel music is the type of music that dominates that movie. Okay, interesting. It's narrated by Charlton Heston, for the record, who actually, if you were going to cater to the Christian audience of the '90s, you could do worse than Charlton Heston, frankly. But Charlton Heston, obviously, he's got so much history as the star of
Voice of
Ben-Hur
Moses,
and
yeah,
the
or not
Moses and
voice
all
of
that.
Moses,
Yeah, he played
Moses,
him. He
yeah,
played him. The
yeah,
whole body of Moses too.
yeah, yeah.
But and so anyway, so there's all these superficial things, of course, but then the actual story as depicted, and they keep a lot of it true to the myths too, is Christ is born on a mountain in Olympus. Hades, the god of death, is jealous and wants to rule Olympus and the world. And so he sends his demon people to go attack Jesus with snakes. And they turn into snakes, right? Then that's from the myth, but it's also got poignant
Yeah, I was
Christian
gonna say
imagery in it.
that's, yeah.
Um, but they don't kill him. They manage to remove most of his divinity, but he still has divinity. So he is a half god, half
It's a
human.
kenosis. It's a
Yeah, it
kenosis.
is. Yeah,
Yeah.
he loses.
He empties
Now,
himself. I mean, not
we don't
himself,
want to,
but he's
I'll
emptied.
I'll do the obligatory. Jesus is not half god, half man. He's whole god, whole man. He's not the same thing as a demigod. But whatever. This is just an analogy, right? But he is definitely the son of the king of the gods, and he is definitely a human formed divine person. And he goes through his life. He experiences the ups and downs of it. He falls in love with a chick named
Meg.
Megira.
Meg, yeah.
I wonder what her name means. I've never looked that up. I
No.
wonder if it has some kind of symbolic purpose. But or maybe it's just the name of his wife from the Greek myth. I don't remember. Um but and then eventually he has to go and I mean, this is an old movie, folks. Like Hades manages to unleash like the Titans, which are the
The
enemies of the gods. They're gonna
chaos, yeah.
take their chaos
Chaos symbols.
monsters. Yeah. And he's going to destroy everything, and Hercules has to descend. He manages to
It
kill
actually,
Meg.
did you ever read Paradise Lost? It kind of has the opening, like the Paradise Lost resonance with me. But sorry, keep going.
Oh, sure. No, no. He has to save his beloved by descending into the underworld, in which point he sacrifices himself to death, and
And death cannot contain him, right?
death cannot contain him.
Yeah.
He can't do it. There's even these like fate
The
witch women,
fates. Yeah, the fates.
yeah,
They cut the
that are
string.
they're trying to cut the string, and right because of his self-sacrifice,
Mm.
his full divinity, let's just say his full divinity shines forth. His full divinity manifests itself
He
in his
has the
sacrifice.
apotheosis, right? If you want
He
to go back to
does.
Joseph
Yes.
Campbell. He
There
has
you
his
go. That's right. And so they're unable to kill him, and then he goes and he casts death into and death is depicted as a giant whirlpool, a giant watery grave
Tartarus,
where all
to go
yeah,
back to Greek
you know,
mythology.
and he casts death into death,
Mm.
and all that stuff, and then yeah, everything about it is remarkably remarkably typical
It's
of Christian
like you don't
thought.
even have to try that hard to see it.
No,
see
you don't.
parallels.
It's just right there. You just watch it. So
the other one, actually, the one more example that I thought was really good, and it's not as well known, but the author is more well known than this actual work. So you're probably familiar with. I know we've talked about the Hunger Games before. We talked about the Hunger Games in regards to the scapegoat, right? So obviously not just the movie series, but it was based off of the book series by Suzanne Collins. And Suzanne Collins, actually before she wrote Hunger Games, she had another series, a young adult series called Gregor the Overlander. Did you ever read that one? It hasn't been turned into a movie yet.
I've honestly never even heard of it.
So what's great about it is, the main character, his name is Gregor, and he's called the Overlander, even though he's just a regular Earth kid. But that's because the main part of the story takes place under the ground of New York City. And he is like, and it basically has to do with, I think his sister is either kidnapped or she falls down this drain that takes them underground. And there's all these species of different animals and people or humanoid like things. And he becomes this, and it's a 5-book series. And my kids and I have read it together. It's really good. But, and it's, well, anyway, the entire aspect, because what she's trying to do is she's taking this descent into the underworld and the conquering of the enemy. And she's making it, well, what if Holy Saturday was a 5-book series, basically? Or, I mean, I should say originally.
Are you saying that Gregor is standing in for the Christ figure then? Is that kind of what's happening?
Well, yeah.
Here?
So I mean, if you were, and we're not going to go through all the details right now, but even if you just took the first book is really indicative of the whole thing. And I don't know if maybe she originally had a 5-book series planned, or if the first book was so successful that she turned it into 5. I'm not sure about any of that, but she basically takes that idea of descending into the underworld, the descent, and how, like we were saying about Jesus, before his descent on Good Friday to Holy Saturday, his entire life was a descent from heaven to earth. And so what if you took that and you made that an action-packed book series or whatever. And so it's no, I would strongly recommend it.
Well, no, I mean, I think the moral of the story is that everything about, like, we're all supposed to constantly kind of like die daily to ourselves, right? So we do bring in this idea of a descent in the underworld, because this reality itself is akin to that, as you've talked about. And then ultimately we're going to have to go the full measure. Ultimately, we're going to die, and we are called to die. We're supposed to die. But Jesus has transformed death into, into a friend, so to speak, or at the very least into a necessary culmination.
Well, in the same way that, like you said, we're going to die anyway. The question is just, are we going to rise? And the question of if we're going to rise is only going to be answered by how united are we in our death with the one who rose first. And so, yeah, we're going to die anyway. But if we unite our death to the death of Christ, and how do we do that again? Well, that's through baptism, right? That's why you submerge into the water 3 times, the 3 days in the tomb, and then you emerge as part of the body of Christ. And it was that same body that rose on Easter Sunday, that rose physically or ascended into heaven. And then, we want to ascend. We want to be part of that body too.
I dig it. Lots of stuff, man. Well, there's so much, there's too much to talk about. And it'll be fun to revisit some of these individual stories and flesh them out some more. But I think for today, what else can we say, right? So.
No, yeah. And I mean, I always enjoy having these sorts of conversations, and look forward to talking about Dante with you again and having you guys come back to listen. I want to encourage you to give the show a 5-star rating, like, subscribe, go to Voyage Comics, and maybe buy that Jonah comic that I know I keep making Jacob be the one to sell, but no, it's, and like I've kind of shared, I bought it for myself. I bought it as a gift because we both, really enjoy just kind of that mythological and biblical aspect.
They're going to love that. We straight book-ended this podcast with,
I know,
shilling for their comics.
Phil and Mike are going to be so proud of us, aren't they?
They're going to be so proud of us.
We'll get that pat on the shoulder.
Oh, yeah, you do your little wrap-up thing. Yeah, go.
This is what it is, man. We'll see you guys later.
Oh, is that it? Are we wrapped up? Oh, okay.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.